Emma Wood holds a Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University in Russian history and literature and is currently a teaching writing fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she teaches poetry writing. So let's just jump right into it and talk about what is poetry. Do people disagree on what is poetry and what is not, and do you have your own definition of it?
I'm sure that people do argue about what makes poetry poetry. I do not have my own definition of poetry, though I'm sure that as an undergraduate starting out writing, I was asked to write my own, as I now ask my students to do. But I think what unites definitions of poetry, or at least in my opinion, good definitions of poetry, is the fact that they themselves are often like poetry, and also that they all speak to the fact that poetry really evades definition. It is itself undefinable, and Emily Dickinson famously said, if I feel physically that the top of my head has been taken off, then I know that is poetry, which is to say, you know it when you see it, or you know it when you read it, but it's not something. It's very that's that it evades definition that makes it poetry.
Does it have to take the top of your head off? I mean, does it have to create that kind of an emotional reaction for it to be poetry?
I don't think so. I've always loved that definition, and I do think people gravitate towards it, but in my experience, it doesn't have to sort of shatter my world in that way for me to think that it is poetry. There just needs to be, an emotional truth to it that I can feel in some way.
Is there a line, however indistinct, between prose and poetry? Can you look at something and say, this is poetry, this is prose?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, what distinguishes poetry from prose is the form. And of course, prose poetry exists, and I believe prose poetry is itself poetry. But poetry is inextricably linked to its form. Poetry is an utterance that is said in its particular way, and the way that it is said is just as important as what is being said, and it creates an added tension or an added urgency to what is being said. So, for instance, it's easiest for me to use my own work as an example. When I first came to Iowa in the fall, I wrote a series of sonnets, and how I knew those were working as poems, as poetry, was the tension that was created between the content, which was subject matter sort of from my early girlhood experiences, and sort of often about a woman pursuing a man, which is the opposite of what one expects from a sonnet, given the history of the form, which is often, it's often a male speaker pursuing a female speaker, a male deer pursuing a doe, very famously in a lot of sonnets. So I was sort of inverting the form, and there was a tension within that that made the poems interesting, I think. And if those had been in prose blocks, they might have been sort of humorous, but I think they would have felt pretty self-indulgent. So it's that relationship to form for me.
Now, a lot of people, when they think of poetry, they think of something, well, it rhymes, something that rhymes, something that comes in a verse or stanzas of some kind. But poetry doesn't always rhyme, it doesn't always come in stanzas.
Right.
But does it always have a form of some kind?
Yeah. Even if there's not a recognizable form or a traditional form like a sonnet or a villanelle, I think what makes free verse work is that it's never free verse. Usually the poet has put a constraint upon themselves or upon the poet, upon the poem, or at least a good poet will do that. And so, for instance, there might be a syllable constraint in syllabics. A poet will count the syllables, or there might be something. Each poem needs to be a certain amount of lines, or there might be a sonic thread that is traced throughout the poem. And I think, from my own experience writing, I think that sometimes you can start out with an outside constraint, and then as you're writing, you sort of write your way maybe into another constraint that you didn't realize you were writing towards, which is either to do with a certain type of language you're using, or you fall into, writing in couplets or something else. I think in good poetry there is sort of an unwritten rules which are either imposed by the poet or sort of emerge organically. There's a pattern that emerges.
Well, Robert Frost famously said that writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. On the other hand, T.S. Eliot, as I recall, said that free verse is just as formal as a rondeau if you're doing a good job.
Right, yeah, and I guess I'm thinking of T.S. Eliot. And I do think for beginning poets starting out, I think using form is very, very helpful. Just to learn, to be forced to have that constraint and to concentrate your words, to be forced out of your comfort zone, to find those rhymes and to write in those forms has been very valuable for me and continues to be, and I think is, in my experience teaching, is also very helpful for beginning poets.
Oh, I agree. I'm a total amateur as a poet, just really a very beginner, but I find the strict forms very helpful. The stricter the better, in my opinion.
Yeah, and they can be very generative. They help you to write and to write in more interesting ways, I've found. If I have to find a rhyme word, I'm really pushed out to search for that word, and then sometimes in searching I will stumble upon a word that I would never have chosen, and it takes the poem in an unpredictable direction and a much more interesting one. So it keeps me sort of honest, I guess. If you know too far in advance where the poem is going, it's probably not going to end up being a very good poem.
Right. Now, you and I both are very interested in the sonnet form. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what a sonnet consists of and what are some of the rules and how you go about writing one?
Sure. So the sonnet is one of the oldest forms, Italian form, meaning the word means little song. And Shakespeare is most famous for writing them. His sonnets usually have 14 lines. I do believe he has a couple that are, he has one at least that's 12 lines, I think one that's 16. There are 14 lines, and each line has 10 beats per line, and there's a rhyming pattern that's A, B, A, B.
It's in iambic pentameter, correct?
Right, yeah.
Ta-tum, 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 ta-tum.
Yeah, and though I don't write my sonnets in pentameter, but and then towards the end there's what's called a volta, or a turn, and in the sort of argument of the poem, and the final lines are rhyming couplets, which usually have sort of a punch. The rhyming couplet is always my favorite.
Right, the Shakespearean sonnet ends in a couplet. The Petrarchan sonnet ends with 6 lines, usually in an ABC rhyme
Right,
pattern.
yeah. That one's a bit different, yeah. And usually now contemporary sonnet writers will sometimes shake up the rhyming patterns in different ways. So it's not a strictly Shakespearean or strictly Petrarchan.
And what would be your process if you were writing a sonnet? If I said, now, sit you down and write a sonnet on whatever subject you like, but it has to be a sonnet. What's your process from there?
I need to find a first line to get going, and once I sort of have found that first line, which sort of sets the tone for the poem, and that first rhyming word, right, then it's a matter of sort of getting through with the rhymes and with that voice and tone that I've set early on. I do use the internet to help me find rhyming words, which feels like cheating, or has felt like cheating, but has also been really incredible for me.
I'm an old fogey, so I still use a physical
rhyming dictionary. Yeah, I have a rhyming dictionary, and I have used it, but I then discovered this website that I can type in any word, and it will give me not only exact rhymes, which are like exact rhymes, like end and bend, but sort of slant rhymes, which is like of and have or something. So it'll give me these like different categories of rhymes, which the nearest rhymes at the top and then the farthest rhymes at the bottom. And that, so I guess that's the way when I'm creating the poem, if I'm stuck in a place, if the word doesn't come naturally and I'm using that site, then words will be suggested to me that are like so exciting and so outside of my normal lexicon that I'll just make lists of the words that seem most interesting. Just going down the list, and I'll make a list of them, and then I'll sort of play around with the ones I like, and usually one of them just feels more correct, and I'll create the line out of that final word, which is how the words take the poem in an interesting direction for me.
So usually, in your case, the rhymes come before the story, what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, they do.
The message comes out of the rhyme rather than vice versa.
Yeah.
All right, and I have usually an entirely different process.
Yeah.
I go the other direction. I decide what I want to say, and then I put it into the form.
I mean, I have an idea of what I'm writing about usually, usually it's a certain experience or thought, but I don't know what I want to say about it necessarily. So.
All right. And what are some of your other favorite poetic forms?
I actually haven't written in that many other traditional forms. I've never written a sestina. I've attempted it. I've never successfully done it. A lot of poetic forms are sort of obsessive in their nature. Thinking of like the sestina or the villanelle. There are others that have a lot of repetition built into them, and I don't have an obsessive nature, and so those don't appeal to me. But there's the sonnet I found at the right time, and it just sort of I did become obsessed with it, I suppose. But I haven't had that experience with other forms.
And we were having a conversation just this morning, as a matter of fact, in your poetry writing class. You were critiquing a sonnet that I had submitted, and you were saying that it ought to be more contemporary. It sounded like it was written in the 19th century. And I'm saying, well, yeah, I meant it to be. I meant it to sound that way.
Well,
but what are some of the differences between how poetry was written then and how it's written now, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, well, just to respond to you briefly, I wondered if you would bring that up. I do think, of course you can write a poem and mean it. Maybe it's an exercise. You mean it to sound like that, and it's sort of an exercise. But if you're sort of playing with the notion of the sonnet, I think it's fun to acknowledge the tradition and its traditional language. But I think a good poem needs to be in conversation with contemporary English and with its time. But what was the rest of your question?
Well, I was wondering if you could tell me what are some of the good and bad points of writing in a different style than modern conversation, or what are some of the good and bad points of writing in a modern style as opposed to a more classical style?
Yeah, well, I think, it comes back to what you want your poetry to be. If you want to be a part of the modern conversation, and I think if you want to be publishing in sort of more mainstream journals, then I think you need to be writing in a more contemporary mode, and because otherwise, what you're producing isn't new. Part of art is making something new, experimenting in some way, sort of progressing forward. There's a history of art, and I think in writing you need to be aware of that history of what has happened, and you need to sort of think of pushing it forward in whatever small way, and also being engaged with what's happening now in language, which is exciting. I love 19th century novels, and I love old poems. But it doesn't mean you can't use words like sooth, or you play with old constructions, old sentence constructions. But I do think that you need to do so in a kind of knowing manner, in a way that with like a sort of a wink at the reader, or or something. So yeah, something like that.
Now, what are some of the most common mistakes that a very beginning poet will make that just make it not good poetry? And how do you avoid those mistakes?
A common mistake I see, and a mistake that I made when I was starting out, was I would sit down to write, and I had the word poetry, on my back. It felt like the weight of that word on my back, and the history of literature on my back, and I felt so self-conscious when I sat down to write that I would just sort of overly poeticize experiences. I would sort of obscure what happened because I was trying to write something that had literary symbols and sort of felt literary and had significance in that mysterious way that I saw poems as having significance. And in doing that, I was writing something that was just completely confusing. It was a weird little puzzle with no answer that maybe sounded good, but sort of unraveled if you press too hard at it. And so I do think I see poets sort of obfuscating, and sort of there's a fear of just staying true to an experience or an emotion, which doesn't mean the factual truth, but the sort of emotional truth.
So there's such a thing as being too clever, too arcane, whatever.
Yeah, and too sort of poetic, or yeah. And then the other thing I would say, which seems like it contradicts the first point, but it doesn't, is I see too much of an adherence to making sense and to following rational logic, and to sort of staying with the subject of the poem as the poet sees it. And really, when you're writing, you need to be open to, as with the sonnet, to letting a word come in and sort of derail the idea of the poem that you thought you had, and let your subconscious come in a little bit, because really your subconscious is better at making interesting connections. It's better at writing poems than your conscious mind is, though your conscious mind doesn't think so. And so you need to sort of trust the instinct that makes you link sentences and thoughts together. I remember one of the first exercises that I had, a teacher gave me. It was just write 7 sentences down as quickly as you can without thinking that much about it. And then he looked at me and he said, maybe you need to relineate, maybe you need to edit, but that is a poem. And it just blew my mind. And it was like, you're right, this is a poem. And it was, at the time, it was like better than anything I'd been writing. And I just did that for a while. I wrote a few poems that were just, me writing these sentences and then sort of editing it a bit. And it was just revelatory. Yeah.
Now, you got your bachelor's degree from Harvard in Russian history and literature. And do you write poetry in Russian as well as in English?
I don't. I don't think my Russian, I did do some translating, but I could not write good poetry in Russian.
Does your knowledge of Russian literature, and for history for that matter, does that inform your poetry at all?
It's hard to tell how things you read inform your own work, I think, as the writer, but I have written poems that are in conversation, overtly in conversation with with Anna Karenina, for instance. I wrote a series of poems in which I was writing sort of out of that character, or sort of as that character, but I haven't, not recently.
Amazing. What drew you to all things Russian?
Just the literature. I read Tolstoy, and then I guess it was also the history. I had sort of, growing up, I had sort of that child's morbid fascination with historic periods like Stalin, and I read about that. In high school, in high school history class, and I found communism sort of appealing, though it had ended so badly for the Soviet Union. And then once I discovered the literature, I decided to take a Russian language class, and it was just sort of a rabbit hole.
Okay. And I understand that you are also married to another poet. And do you compete with each other? Do you work together? Do you collaborate? How does that work, being married to another poet?
Yeah, it doesn't feel competitive. We write our writing is I guess it's become increasingly similar because there's a bit of cross-pollination or influence on each other, but we do write very, very differently, and we're trying to do different things, I think, with our writing. And we also each have, he's sort of into academic writing, and I also write essays, so we have sort of separate areas as well. But we do read each other's work, and he's reading my thesis manuscript now and helping me edit it as I prepare to submit that this spring. And it's, it's really fun to be able to talk about our writing. I guess it can be frustrating when he's in a really productive period and I'm sort of trying to write and beating my head against the wall, but mostly it's nice.
So you're able to avoid any type of envy, competitiveness, jealousy, what have you?
Yeah, I would say in the beginning it was maybe harder for me. I've had some writer envy. He's known he wanted to be a poet longer and is in a different place in his career. But I've made peace with that. So.
Okay. Well, now I think we've got a few minutes left, and so I would like to hear you read one or two of your favorite poems, if you would like, and then we can talk about them briefly.
Okay, I don't know if they're my favorite. These are poems I wrote last semester. How long should I take?
Oh, we've got maybe, 8 minutes or so.
8 minutes? Okay.
10.
10? Okay. At the cafe, this is from a series called Quotidian. At the cafe, I brush away another fly. My husband, his coffee cake half-eaten, a brown ring at the base of his mug, tears a dollar bill to pieces, concentrating. This is what we talk about when we talk about cuts in. The abstracted look on his face when he writes, a penny for that gathering. I am still learning how to be interrupted and shut the door most days. My grandmother was a good wife. She couldn't sit still. For a time, I couldn't either. Sweeping, dusting, picking up. I don't cook meat. Nothing's ever done. I nearly stepped on a bird. It flew upward and away, white rustle. Behind me, a pickup truck brakes with a scream. No, I screamed. He said, I said, he said. He moved into the sun to sneeze. I cleaned the windows from the inside, pausing for the guttural hum of a plane, odd at this hour. The white dowel that twists open, the white blinds, is swinging back and forth. A cold current enters. I moved it, didn't I? That dream again with my ex, I can't quite remember. I was half daughter and loved him accordingly. Electronic wind chimes, wake up, and the dogs ready for their routine. The kettle doesn't hold enough for us both in the morning. I boil just enough for myself, a stray grain burning into ash. The grass in our yard, so wet mornings, it's as if it rained in the last dark, unreal, an imposter. It grows much faster. The other side of the fence is elsewhere. Come back. Wading into a low, muddy stream, a fawn leapt onto the path. In front, just like that, froth on her mouth. Sun's out on a cold day, the park bereft of, free of, and she and me alone in it.
All right. Now, I observe that it's mostly written in couplets.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I'm not quite sure what the form is. Can you explain it?
Yeah, well, there isn't a set pattern. There's no syllabics or anything. It's mostly couplets with occasional single lines. And the lines tend to be shorter, but it's not a set form. I mean, I was thinking, I was reading sort of a lot of haikus and thinking about that form at the time, and also this poet called Lorene Nideker, who writes, she has her own sort of version of the haiku.
And is it important that you convey a specific message with this poem, or is it pretty much up to the reader to get what can be gleaned from it?
I'm not sure what you mean by a specific message.
I mean, were you trying to say something specific and you would be disappointed if somebody didn't get it?
I'm never trying to say something specific that I would be so specific that I'd be disappointed if someone didn't get it. I think even when it seems like I'm saying something more, I don't know that I'm saying that necessarily. So I guess no. Yeah.
Was there a certain, I noticed some rhyme, but not a lot of it. Did you focus on a specific sound or pattern of sounds when you were writing this one?
No, I find that I tend towards rhyme even when I don't specifically want to rhyme in a form. I end up doing it because it's just it's an unconscious thing, and sometimes I do it and it's too much rhyme, even when I'm not deciding to do it. But yeah, I mean, I think each poem that one writes has its own sound, and you sort of have to discover that sound as you're writing, and that's, to me, the exciting thing about starting a new poem or a new series of poems is sort of getting comfortable with the sound and with the rhythm of that specific piece. And, you know, I mean, a poem can have a rhythm even if there's not a sort of set metrical pattern to it. It has a kind of sound to it. So, yeah.
If a person wants to know more about poetry and maybe eventually write some poetry of his own, who are some of the best poets for a person to study? Who are some of your favorites, and who are some of your least favorites, if you
My
feel
least
like going
favorites,
there?
let me think of the first part first. Yeah, yeah, it's been, as I said, I'm not an obsessive person, so I find I'll read a single poem or a single book, and I'm satisfied to remain there. If I like it, even if I like it, I want to sort of seek out all the work by that writer. And I do find my favorite poets have been changing in the past couple of years. I've been reading so much poetry, and my own work has been changing a lot, and my own conception of what a poem can be has been changing. So, which is to say, some of my old favorites have been recently deposed, or I've sort of outgrown. But Emily Dickinson isn't obvious, but it is a constant for me. There's a spareness to her writing, but also just such a lushness of language. And there's kind of a wildness in her writing that I love. And I love Robert Creeley. We read some in class. For me, there's a terseness to his writing. And when I first heard a recording of him reading his own work, which he reads, he has these very sort of these short lines, and he stops at every line break. It was the way he reads. It sounds so desperate. I found it sort of amazing. And so his idea of the line, this sort of terse line with these harsh stops, is still sort of. I'm still sort of thinking about that.
And are there any poets that you consider totally overrated or totally spurious?
I don't know if I want to make any enemies. But, I don't. I don't. I mean, I'm sure I could think of someone, but I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Every reader has their own blind spots.
All right. Well, now, a question that has been interesting to me over the years is that I have always felt that there is a distinct difference between men's poetry and women's poetry. Do you agree with me on that or not?
No. No, I guess I don't. Do you mean formally or what? Or
just in terms of what they like?
Well, yeah. What do you think the difference is?
Well, when I was a kid, A. Milne's poetry, my mother would always read to me the ones that didn't have such concrete imagery, such as Binker or Halfway Down. My dad would read poems that told a story. And
but maybe it's just your parents.
Maybe it's just my parents. But thank you so very much for coming on this show. Thank you for reading that poem, which I like very much. And I'm sure that we will continue to work well together in your poetry class. And I wish you all the best for your future career as a poet. Thank you again,
Thanks, Joseph.
and thank you all.